So I wanted to create a PowerPoint presentation that might be helpful because we all learn in different ways. The Fawn response, why people pleasing is actually a trauma response, and ways that we can move towards healing. So one of the things to think about when you think about are you a fawner or the fawn response in individuals, it really is about being disconnected from one's own body and their own needs, and that you become highly aware and attuned to other people's somatic cues. So you are good at reading people in terms of their behavior. You are good at observing things in others. A part of this is also falling into the role of being a caretaker or being codependent. And you might notice that there's difficulty setting boundaries, and you kind of walk in a room and you scan what's going on in terms of what and how you probably need to show up next. And one of the other things you might notice is just the difficulty saying no, and that there is this avoidance of conflict, and that you tend to be more easygoing in your demeanor. You're more of a people pleaser, but this often leads to struggles with identity and often feeling like there's a lack of identity. So the fawn response really represents one of the most misunderstood trauma response because it's often disguised as kindness, helpfulness, or simply just really being a good person. So if you are a fawner, think about the comments that other people have made to you throughout your life. Or if you're curious about if you're in a relationship with someone, if they are also fawning, what kind of things do you feel show up in their personality? And have you also maybe made comments like, I'm dating someone, they're so helpful, they're so kind in what they do. And not that that's bad, but that should at least be a point of curiosity. Yet beneath these kind of agreeableness, ways that we show up really lies this complex survival strategy. And for me, I feel like it deserves recognition and compassion. I am also someone who identifies as what I call fawning by default. I understand firsthand the exhaustion of constantly scanning environments for other people's needs. And a part of my experience is to please other and to show up in ways that are convenient for others, to have people getting along. Some examples of a fawn response are going to be smiling and laughing, maybe while discussing some painful experiences. Another thing is ignoring your own needs, your own wants, your desires, putting other people first, like all the time, not even some of the time, like all the time, blaming themselves. And also believing like maybe I deserve the abuse, something like that kind of comes up sometimes. And then there's even denial about abuse. So we make excuses in relationships with others. And that could be even in a romantic relationship or a family relationship, any relationship, an employee and coworker relationship. We really make excuses for behaviors that can be abusive. What we find in childhood is often this parental role and kind of having more responsibility than maybe some of the other siblings. What you'll also see is never asking for needs, like beyond I need water or I need food, probably good quality water and good quality food, is the individual rarely asks for their needs, and other people rarely ask them what their needs are as well. You may also see low or maybe more contained expressions of emotions like anger or sadness, maybe even if there's hurt in the presence of others. So these might be people who might make comments like, I don't like to cry, it's a sign of weakness, or they tend to cry in private alone and not in the presence of others. So those are some things to kind of be mindful of. It really is a part of this bigger system, and I just want to touch on this a little bit. And I have several videos that talk about our nervous system and how it operates from fight and flight and freeze. This is specific to fawn. And I kind of think of it like this. Fight is the inner warrior. That's the anger, the confrontation, the I stand my ground. When I say no, I mean no, and I'm physically ready for a fight. My jaws are clenched, my fists are balled, my physical structure is tight, and I might even have like this rage brewing in my gut. And then there's the flight, and that's kind of like the gazelle. I don't know if you've ever watched gazelles kind of in their natural habitat, but there's some anxiety. They definitely do some avoiding because they will go away and fast from any type of perceived threat. It's kind of like they're always in this heightened state of escape. And it really, you can see it in humans in terms of fidgety arms and legs. Maybe their eyes are constantly moving around looking for, how can I get out of this situation? How can I exit? And there's even a sense in terms of how people report it that they feel like they're crawling out of their skin. So that may sound familiar to you, that may be a default setting, because I think we all cycle through these parts in our nervous system. But as I say, think about what your default setting is, what you're likely to go to more frequently when maybe you're just reacting in a situation. And then there's the freeze. That's the inner deer. You ever seen a deer in their headlights? They just freeze, and you don't even know if it's a real animal or a statue. There's this shutting down, this disassociation, a numbness, and they'll often report, I was present, but I wasn't present. So it feels like they're stuck, definitely disconnected, and they're kind of just watching life happen, but they're not actually participating in life. And then there's the fawn, which is really the inner diplomat. That is the people pleasing, the codependency, the wanting to appease things, one to remove any perceived threats that might be going on. And the fawn, based on research and my clinical experience, fawn really shows up when the other three haven't worked. And so it can be a default for people. Their primary default may be flight. When flight is not working, remember the inner gazelle, I have to, I'm anxious and I want to avoid things, then they might go to a fawn response as a way of trying to appease and get along so that you can get out of that perceived threat. And that was really developed by Peter Walker, who identified the fawn response as a survival skill. And it kind of, and he quotes it as, if I can't beat them, outrun them, hide from them, maybe I will charm them into not hurting me. And so, right, like if I can't beat them, maybe that's the fight. If I can't outrun them, that's definitely the flight. And if I can't hide from them, that's the freeze response. Then my other option, plan D, is to see if I can get them on my side. So let's go a little bit deeper in terms of the connection with the fawn response. It really is the genius of the nervous system that orchestrates, peace when peace doesn't exist. It develops typically in childhood when there's the ideas of safety and love and survival really becoming what other people need them to be. So you might have very needy parents or a parent who may struggle in terms of attachment, and that particular child attaches to the parent in that way. And then a fawn response kind of with practice, because we're practicing fawning all the time in childhood, then becomes the default setting. Their authentic feelings and needs become really dangerous to express. So they learn how to survive through that process. So, some characteristics are hypervigilance of other emotional states, disconnected from one's own thoughts, feelings, needs, desires, things like that. When asked questions about like, what do you want? What are some of your goals? It really is difficult for them to verbalize or articulate. One thing I'll ask is, what do you enjoy eating? What would you say would be your favorite meal that's not fast food? And sometimes those things for fawners are hard to articulate because they may just say a salad, but they don't know if they like butterhead salad, arugula, spinach, deciphering the difference. And as you start to understand whether or not you fall into this response, it really is prioritizing others' comfort over your personal authenticity. It's kind of the theme of let's do what's best for you, not even the main group, but what's best for you versus what's best for me. And so even in social engagements, you'll see like this survival skilled shield show up. And I kind of have divided it into the relaxed, immobilized, and mobilized. And this really comes from the theories by the automatic nervous system states and polyvagal theory. And so in a relaxed state, we're in the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is like our heart is beating normal, our muscles are relaxed. We feel relaxed and engaged, curious about life, curious about the conversation. We can be creative and optimistic. And then when we start to become a little bit more activated, but not quite there, we're getting to an immobilized state. So this is where the parasympathetic nervous system, we're still there, but then we start to have some dorsal vagal pathways. And this is the lower heart rate, low muscle tone, low energy. You might feel maybe a little bit in a dreamy state, more in a meditative state, kind of like you're kind of floating. But this, in an unsafe way, can be associated with things like depression, feelings of not finding joy or happiness in life. Loneliness is a big thing that I hear. Feelings of hopelessness, right? And so when we think about hopelessness in terms of how that emotion is expressed, we also, in terms of my profession as a psychodynamic therapist, also have to say like, oh, if I have a client who's feeling hopeless, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking that there's some suicidal thoughts behind that, because research says that there's a direct connection between that emotional expression. And then if we kind of like move over to the mobilized state, this is where really the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated. You will start to see that increase in heart rate. Your blood pressure absolutely goes up. There's a hormonal disruption in that because cortisol, excessive cortisol may start to be released, even adrenaline in the body, which is kind of the body's way to keep things balanced. But this is happening so often. We're in a parasympathetic, we're in a sympathetic response so frequently that it's overwhelming the system. Then, and I guess in a positive way, there's this idea, does it bring you to a place of motivation? Does it make you more energized and playful or more active? But when it's kind of left unchecked, it will continue to rise to that fight or flight. You'll have those hormones of cortisol and the adrenals. The cortisol and the adrenaline released in the body. Stress is there. Stress is probably one of the number one killers for most people who have diseases in our body because of the fatigue and the imbalance of hormones. But then there's also maybe like this anxiousness and fear that kind of come down. And then let's talk a little bit about childhood, where, research really says the fawn response, as the little diplomat who has learned that being helpful equals being safe. So as a child, someone whose default is fawn, they've learned in terms of their experience, particularly in family relationships, because those are the earlier experiences that we have, that if they can be diplomatic and follow the social rules, then that will equal safety for them. And then that's why that pattern continues to be repeated and repeated. And so like a quote might be, if I'm perfect, helpful, and never cause problem, they'll love me and keep me safe. And so part of the fawn response also involves parentification. So when a child takes on responsibilities that maybe they're too young to assume, They develop this uncanny emotional radar, which is, they can determine the shifts in moods in other people just maybe by physical appearance, whereas other siblings are not picking up on that. They may constantly ask, are you okay? Can I help you? Like they want to bring something forward in terms of their verbal expression to alleviate someone else's suffering. It's like they're cleaning up the mess, even though they didn't make the mess. And they definitely become the family mediator, sacrificing their own wants and needs just to keep the peace within the family. So think about other people in your family. Who's the fawner? Think about who's the fighter, who will leave a situation, who freezes, and who fawns. Because we have all of these personality types in our environment. And another part of that is they're also considered the good kid because they're considered compliant. Parents like it for the most part because the parent feels that they have a mini therapist, which is really just not a good way to have that role reversal shift. And then what about trauma responses, right? They are the people pleasers. They're unable to say how they really think and feel. They care for others in ways that are detrimental to their own needs. They're constantly saying yes, even though those requests can be overwhelming. And this is very important. They struggle with low self-esteem. But most people won't pick up on it because most people perceive them as being happy and nurturing to them. So keep that in mind, that this is really also a self-esteem issue for this individual. They struggle to take up space and express their needs to others. They definitely avoid conflict. And there's this internal feeling, and I think sometimes resentment that develops that they're being taken advantage of. And they don't always express that in relationships. They do express that in therapy. They do express that when maybe there's a little bit more openness in a conversation with someone and they trust that that information is not going to be used against them at a later point. They will express that. And kind of concerned about fitting in with others. I know for me, those have been issues that I've struggled with, particularly in my early 20s, really feeling like where was my place to fit in and really overexerting and trying to please everyone. Didn't really kind of focus on me and what kind of damage that was bringing about. So children learn that their worth depends on their usefulness, that love must be earned through service, and that their own needs are somewhat inconvenient and can be dangerous. So then what happens when, during our teenage years, when we're just so wonderfully, beautifully appreciated and loved, and people understand the adolescent development because they too went through it. We know like that really it's not how people show up, but I'm hopeful in that sense. So during adolescence, the Fawn response creates this unique challenge because this particular developmental stages, they involve things like identity formation, boundary setting, value clarification. It really is an opportunity to be able to express yourself and find out who you are. So someone whose default is a fawn reaction is less likely to show up with these developmental expressions and more likely to internalize them. And that adds back to what I said earlier in terms of the low self-esteem. A fawning teenager becomes a shapeshifter. And when I was writing this, I was thinking I remember even only a few years ago when I was going to a Halloween party and we had to dress up as heroes, superheroes or something like that, what I wanted to do, and I picked shapeshifter. And so as I'm writing this, I'm like, oh, so do I really want to be a character that shapeshifts, or am I fawning as my default, going to a social setting so that I can fit in with other people? And that is absolutely how it shows up. You have to slow down. You have to be intentional about what, your default setting is so that you can recognize it. And it really is about presenting different versions of yourself in these social contexts. And so you might see it in terms of teachers. They won't report it. They report that this is a great student. The student listens. This is not a behavioral child. And so whenever I hear teachers express children in terms of they're very likable and things like that, I'm like, oh, I got to do a depression assessment. I got to see if this young person is internalizing, and if their default is fawning because they're not safe enough, and something about safety might be going on. In peers, they're always agreeable. They go along with the flow. Where do you want to eat? I don't know. Wherever you want to eat. What do you want to do today? I don't know. Whatever you want to do today. So they may engage in activities that maybe are not of particular interest, but they don't want to say anything in the group. They just kind of go along. As a parent, these are usually the kids that don't rebel. This is why parents tend to like them the best or feel like there's a closer attachment, which is really can be an unhealthy relationship because the child ends up being an emotional support for the parent. And that changes the dynamics and kind of disrupts the development of the child. So even if you are a parent and you have a child or maybe multiple children, think about what are your children, which one of your children are fawners, and instead of dismissing it in terms of they're a great child, think about what could be going on internally for them, particularly in terms of their self-esteem development. Some of the challenges are asserting independence feels terrifying because it might lead to rejection. If they say something, they can be rejected. Rejected from a family member, rejected from a peer relationship, rejected at work and not included in the majority. So, this is why academically there might be some struggles in terms of intelligence because they're so preoccupied with helping other people meet their emotional needs, and that includes peers and teachers and even like the staff at school. They're always kind of, how are you doing today? You might see that show up at times. And they kind of like become everyone's therapist while neglecting their own needs. And then this is just a little chart in terms of typical team development, and see how broad and more useful they can expand in terms of boundary setting and self-advocacy and emotional autonomy, making independent decisions and value clarification. And when you're fawning, see how much you are limited in terms of your expression during development, especially during your teenage years. And then we go into adulthood. And in young adulthood, the fawn response begins to really extract a heavier toll as life demands more stuff. You really start to have a desire to want to have more authentic choices and deeper relationships as a normal part of coming into young adulthood. In terms of career choices, you might see that they go into helping professions. I'm a psychotherapist. And roles about pleasing others is rewarded. And often these people, I just want to be helpful to people. I want to be useful to people. They often are overworked and taking on extra responsibilities really without getting the recognition or compensation. They're less likely to speak up. They're more likely to comply and do. And in intimate relationships, there's this difficulty of expressing their needs, and it can lead, and often does lead, to resentment. They are typically attracted to partners who need fixing. And so think about your partner. If you think you're a fawner by default, look at the partners or the people that maybe you've had romantic relationships in the past with. Was the idea that they need some fixing, they need some help. You could be their mini therapist without really sending them to get professional help. And they're really emotionally unavailable. So think about like you coming into a relationship. Does your partner show up unemotional or emotionally unavailable? And are you there to kind of help them work through some stuff? There really is that struggle with authentic intimacy, because it should be dispersed more equally than you always being the giver and never being the receiver. And then there's identity formation, like who am I when no one else wants anything for you? Do you feel like you still have worth? Or is that even a terrifying question? Because if nobody wants me or needs me, then I have a sense of worthlessness, or even imposter syndrome. And this is just a little in terms of how energy can be allocated in a fawn response. And you can see a big portion of other needs, others' emotions, others' opinions, just taking in others' opinions without the ability to express your own needs, your own emotions, and your own desires. And you see that particularly with desires, it gets smaller and smaller. So think about that in terms of how, if your default is fawning, how can maybe you expand some of your own needs, your own emotions, and your own desires. Maybe that it's a little bit more equal, or maybe even a little bit more heavy on your own development, on your own self-esteem, until you really start becoming aware and can identify these things in the moment. And then what happens as we mature? You know, the body begins to signal what the mind has been denying, and years of suppressing these authentic needs and emotions really take a physical toll. You'll see chronic headaches and jaw tension, and that leads to all kind of sorts of things in terms of balance and the way that we're moving in terms of flexibility. There's shallow breathing. You might see heart-related issues, and that can be not just heart disease, high blood pressure, anything to do with the circulatory system in terms of the heart. Although you know these are clusters, because heart-related issues are also a part of fight. And the anger that builds up in the body. You'll see digestive issues and sometimes swallowing issues. What people on the outside usually will say to someone who's typically a fawner is they must be going through a midlife crisis. But really, that individual is said, I've been taking care of people for far too long. My body is communicating, and I really need to become my authentic self if I want to be the healthiest version of myself. And so the body has been sending these signs for far too long, and we just can't ignore them anymore. Often because disease, an illness has started to manifest in the body. So some questions are, who am I beyond what I do for others? What is my existence other than what I do for you or for other people? What do I actually want for life? What is my purpose? Why am I here? Exploring those things. Another thing is like, why am I feeling exhausted all the time? Let's not just dismiss it because of maybe hormonal changes or not a good night's sleep or poor diet or not exercising enough. Let's really kind of think about fatigue and exhaustion in this body. Where can it be coming from? Can you feel exhausted because the relationships you have are exhausting? This is a reflection, you know, and I always say in terms of awakening and having curiosity and trying to figure out one person's life, you know, this is painful for some people, but it's often the doorway to healing and reclaiming the authentic self. There's that phrase, if I keep doing the same thing over and over, how can I get a different result? Well, let's try something new. And in trying something new, there might be some sad moments. There might be some tears. It might feel as if it is painful and that you are suffering. Once you get past that, what's on the other side? Healing, healing, healing. That's what makes it so beautiful. What are some of the physical impacts? The fawn response creates a stage of chronic physiological stress as the body is just constantly trying to be vigilant to help others, their needs and their emotions. So you're going to see things like chronic fatigue, shallow breathing, digestive issues. I first got diagnosed with digestive issues, IBS, in my 20s. Then shortly what followed was acid reflux issues. Then I started to have other things like thyroid related things. The clenching of the jaw. So around my mid 20s, early 30s, I started having issues with hypoglycemia. And that, if you know a little bit in terms of Chinese medicine, that is related to the jaw and the clenching and the tightness of years and years and years without being able to just fully relax and release. The nervous system, fawning creates a unique pattern of the nervous system dysregulation. So with the ventricle vagal, it's socially engaged, is really on the surface. You don't see a lot of depthness into relationships. The sympathetic part is the internal hypervigilant and anxiousness. And then you have the dorsal vagal, which is really that periodic collapse and that shutdown, complete disassociation in an unhealthy way when things are feeling and experiences being overwhelmed. This constant shifting between the states of physical wear and tear on the body, chronic health issues, and autoimmune disorders and conditions. So it is like when something's going on, the body sends messages. Are you listening? And so that was childhood. The messages got a little bit louder in adolescence. They started to get even louder in young adulthood. They're screaming around your 30s and your 40s. And then at this point, you might have already entered into a disease state. And so like it's about what can I do to come back from that so that I can heal. And there's always healing involved. I'm a big proponent of that. What are the physiological impact? The fawn response creates this complex web of psychological challenges that affect the self-concept, the self-esteem, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves in our bodies, and just us in general, our relationships, whether or not we feel that we can keep our emotions regulated, or our emotions feel all over the place. And so there's some key things in terms of the psychological impact, the identity issues, emotional patterns, relationship patterns. In terms of mental stress or mental health, you'll have the anxiety, the depression, the post-traumatic stress disorder that always feels like a 10 and never like a 2. The chronic shame, the chronic feeling of rejection, and maybe social isolation. And then you have thoughts that people will say in terms of, I think I'm an imposter, not feeling like I'm my authentic self. So when you say that or think that, instead of dismissing it, become curious about where that thought may be coming from. The subconscious mind might be talking to you. Having unclear boundaries and feeling overwhelmed, that emotional exhaustion, you're just drained and it's only 10 a.m. So really think about what is going on, because you deserve to know what your body is saying, how to work with the body, the nervous system, and not against it, to where you don't have to suffer and you can lean towards, move towards a wellness plan that brings you success, happiness, and health. And then there's some cognitive distortions. And a cognitive distortion is a thought that comes in that probably is not the most helpful. And so they're really based on a false belief system. And in terms of psychodynamic therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is referred to as CBT, these can be helpful in determining what may be your specific cognitive distortions. But some of them may be, they'll think I'm selfish if I say no. And then I'm like, oh, so now we can mind read people, right? Like, oh, now you can guess what people are going to say about you. Catastrophizing. It's like, if I disappoint them, they'll leave me. And some of that is like that all or nothing thinking too. If I'm either perfectly helpful or completely worthless. And I always say that's that black and white. It's either yes or no, and the mind doesn't want to discuss all the stuff in between or even outside of the yeses and the nos. Should statements. I should always put others first. That's the way. That's what God wants me to do. That's what means a good citizen, is that you're supposed to take care of everybody else. Ooh, you don't want to be selfish, because that is a bad personality characteristic to have. And what I say, it's not selfish. I do things and engage in things that are self-energizing first. And when I am self-energized, that makes me available to others with limits, with boundaries, with the recognizing that you also have your work to do, because I'm not doing all the work, you are. I'm just here kind of helping navigating that. And then there's the emotional reasoning. I feel guilty, so I must have done something wrong. It always goes back to blaming me and not really learning to separate when it's someone else's stuff and when it's your stuff. And that's something in terms of working with me in psychotherapy that comes up a lot. We talk about, is this your stuff coming up? Is this mom or dad's stuff coming up? Is it someone else's, like your boss stuff? Is that coming up? And when and how to identify when it's your stuff. These patterns create a disconnection from authentic feelings and needs, making it more difficult to form these genuine connections and even really experience true intimacy. And when I say true intimacy, I'm not talking sex. I'm talking about having a loving, compassionate relationship with someone else that is based on two authentic personalities showing up with the best versions of themselves. What is the spiritual impact, you said? Perhaps I would say the most profound cost to the Fawn response is that spiritual disconnection, really the loss of the authentic connection to self, others, and purpose. And it's really the price of pleasing others is often loss of one's own soul's voice. And so things to think about is that social mask, that adaptive self, that emotional self, those core values, that authentic soul. And so some of the spiritual consequences look like unable to discern one's true calling versus what others want people to be. Living by others' values rather than your own moral compass. Feeling like an imposter in your own life, and the difficulty forming genuine spiritual connections with others. My spiritual journey has been very beautiful and very familiar only because I am now arrived at a place where I speak my truth, where I can show up in authentic ways, which is not part of the big and the majority. And I still love myself from that. So there are layers of adaptation really to create the distance from the authentic self, and each layer represents a barrier between the social mask and the inner being. So keeping that into contact. What are some things in terms of recognizing the Fawn response in yourself? The first step is self-reflection. This is the key. So here are some questions. Do you find it nearly impossible to say no without feeling guilt or overwhelmingly guilty? Do you apologize automatically even when you've done nothing wrong? Do you know what others' needs before they ask, but struggle to even find your own needs? So you can get all the stuff together and ready for your kids and your partners, but when it comes to you, you're neglectful. Think about if you're going on a trip. Who do you pack for? You pack for everybody else first? Do you pack for yourself first? Do you pack for everybody else and forget to pack some things for yourself because you ran out of time? Do you feel responsible for others' emotions, but even disconnected to your own? These are our empaths. They can connect and give energy, but boy, they get drained in the process, and it shows up in the body. Do you feel like you don't know who you are when you're alone? Is there difficulty being alone? Difficulty going to the movie theaters by yourself? Watching a movie? Difficulty going to the park or a restaurant or a social engagement alone, or a social activity like roller skating or bowling? Can you do those things alone, or is there a lot of resistance to it? Physical, emotional signs: heart racing, exhaustion, just feeling depleted after having a social interaction, maybe some unexplained irritability before or after an event, maybe resentment, particularly in an intimate relationship because you feel this partner is so draining and taking of you. Are you reporting chronic headaches, stomach disruptions, stomach knots, different personalities with different people? Do you feel like you show up differently? You would know this within yourself. And the idea is if you answered yes to 3 or more of the questions, and you recognize that there are some physical signs, then you're probably operating from a fawn response pattern. The nervous system regulation. Healing from fawn response begins with regulating the nervous system to create safety within yourself rather than seeking safety from others. So you could practice that deep diaphragmatic breathing. You could do a 4, inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. You could start with a 4-4-4. Hold, inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale until you start to develop your lung capacity. And that definitely will shift you into the parasympathetic state, particularly if you do longer on the exhale. There's this research tells us about cold exposure and cold water on the face or a cold shower, that can also stimulate the vagus nerve and move the nervous system into this rest state. Humming, gargling in the morning or gargling anytime during the day. So if you feel like you're getting into the fawn response, maybe start humming. That's something that you can do if you don't have the cold water around you. And then that's what, the next one is the humming and the singing can really stimulate the vagus nerve and help to regulate the nervous system while also reducing anxiety. And this is about the connection of the polyvagal approach, and it talks about the neuroceptiveness of safety, creating environments where your nervous system feels genuinely safe, the co-regulation, finding safe relationships where authentic connection is possible. If you have no one in your environment, I'm a big proponent of therapy and a therapeutic relationship where there's a good trust starting to be built, safety starting to build, and over time you can work through co-regulation issues. And then self-regulation, which is developing tools to calm the nervous system independently so you don't have to, or I guess it's so that you can remind the body you're safe. We don't have to be in fight or flight. We can just breathe and let it go. And then here are some practical steps. So beyond nervous system regulation, healing requires really practical daily practices to reclaim your authentic self. So, and I talk about this in my other video, and this is about taking maybe small micro steps towards this. So boundary practice, maybe where there's low risk, and just practicing saying no in ways until you start building up your confidence. Before responding, default to, let me think about it, I'll get back to you. My default is, oh, that's an interesting thought, let me meditate on it. And I usually take days or months, weeks sometimes to meditate on things. Because I really want to not be in a reactive space. I want to be in a place where I'm informed about what decision is going to be right for me, and then expressing that to other people. Whereas the default setting is doing what is best for others and then me suffering through that decision or choice. Doing a needs assessment and inventory, like what do I need? Like I'm feeling some way, what do I need? I'm feeling good and happy and energized. What do I need? I'm feeling sad, maybe a little lonely. What do I need? And then that authentic expression, practicing stating your opinions and preferences without really apologizing or qualifying for them. And I practice this most often with food because I have a very enjoyable diet that I love, that is just really aligned with me, both physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so I express that to others in terms of how I eat now versus before I did not, and I kept that to myself and often ate what other people ate just because I wanted to not be an inconvenience. Now I'm an inconvenience, especially when it comes from food, but I started taking small steps. So I hope that some of this information in terms of my practices and experiences can be helpful for you. And then what are some daily reflective practices? And these are questions that I kind of reflected on. Where did I abandon myself today to please others? What physical sensations arose when I felt the urge to fawn? What need of mine went unmet because I prioritize others? And how can I honor that need tomorrow? And so I talk about it in terms of becoming aware and a healing process, that we don't go from a 5 automatically to a 10. But maybe we think about it in terms of 3 areas: our self-awareness, our boundary setting, and our authentic self, but that we're progressively moving up. And in that diagram, that's what you'll see here. That healing, we want to move up towards healing and not get closer towards illness and disease. And so there's professional support. And I practice psychodynamic therapy, which is really effective in looking at all of our nervous system reactions. And you know, I talk about the fight, I talk about the flight and the freeze. This is specific to fawning, but we can look at all 4 of those. And the psychodynamic approach looks at early relationships, particularly with attachment, and how this starts to develop in childhood, and really uncovering unconscious and subconscious. The unconscious parts are the defense mechanisms that show up that really lead us to want to behaviorally become that people pleasing. Then there's some other theories that are really close aligned with psychodynamic, and that's object relations. And that also looks at how the relationship between the individual and the caregiver, and these internal objects is what they're referred to, but they could be representations that influence some of our current relationships, looking for patterns and things like that to help you understand some of the root of the fawning experience. And then there's self-psychology. And this focuses on developing a comprehensive sense of self and healthy self-esteem, which is really crucial for those who identify or their identity has been shaped by other needs and expectations. So when you think about, if you're looking at coming into therapy, and maybe you don't reside in California or Nevada, so you're not able to work with me, these are some other frameworks that when you start reaching out to a clinician, asking them, are they aware of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses? I think that I'm a fawner by default. Do you understand, and do you come from a theory with this framework? I also like to offer the idea of hypnotherapy, because this is also can be an amazing healing tool, especially in terms of doing inner child work. And for hypnotherapy, I'm not bound by my license, so you really can reside anywhere, but it can provide you that direct access to the subconscious mind where that fawn response is stored. And it can offer these benefits in terms of bypassing conscious resistance to change, creating safe access to early memories, allowing reparenting of the inner child who learned to fawn, because then we can restructure that so that fawning doesn't become a negative reaction, but that we can use it in healthy ways to help you grow, and installing new neural pathways of the authentic self-expression. And so the radical return to self, healing from the fawn response, is about reclaiming your authentic self and honoring your journey through recognition, compassion, growth. and authenticity. And if this message resonates with you, maybe it's you feel connected in a deep way, or maybe you even kind of identify as, I think I'm fawning by default. This journey is close to my heart. And I have learned just so many valuable lessons of healing through identifying and staying with the sympathetic nervous system. And so if you'd like to work with me, I'd be honored. Reach out to me either by going to my website, which is www.tanyaoctave-lcsw.com. You can offer a comment, like the video, you can follow me. Most platforms I'm known as @Holistic Clinician, but really this is about educating, giving information to you, seeing if it's resonating, and then now what do you want to do with that if it does resonate with you. So thank you for listening.